I had a great conversation yesterday with a lender, and it amazes me that so many real estate agents are struggling with this NAR stuff. And even going to the point of talking to a lender on how can they deal with it and how they can address it. And it's scary because it's telling me that the brokers, a lot of brokers, are very lost on what to do and how to teach their people and how to train their people. So here's a couple of things I want to help you with. First, when you call up, if you're a buying agent and you call up a listing agent and ask if compensation is being offered by the seller and the seller says no, you cannot refuse to show that house. That's a form of steering, and it's going to snag somebody, and it's going to be a huge fine and a lot of trouble. Think through your job, learn how to negotiate, and learn how to do this. So if that was to happen, you have a buyer that wants to see this house, you found out there's no compensation or concessions being offered by the seller, that's really okay. You go back to your buyer and say, look, they are not going to offer anything to help with the commission as we agreed with on the buyer agency form. They're not going to help you with any closing costs. They're not going to offer any buyer concessions. However, I feel if we put this in the offer, let them decide what they want to do. And go look at the house. Period. Just go look at the house. If the buyer decides they want that, now your job really comes into play, because now you have to be a little bit creative on the numbers to make it work. You can put the offer in, you can put a full price offer in and ask for the concessions. The seller might come back and say, no, we're not going to do that. That's okay. That's not a dead deal, you know. That's not a dead deal. That just means the seller hasn't found the number that they need to hit. You can go ahead and recounter that offer and go back and say, if we offered you more money, here's another number, would you accept the offer? See, there's two parts of the deal. You're the buyer agent side and the seller agent side. On the seller agent side, hopefully when they had their listing interview and they sat down with the seller, a big part of what they did was to find out what the seller wants to net. And that takes a little bit of work. If you go and you talk to a seller on a listing interview, lots of times the seller will throw a number out to you. Like for instance, they'll say, I want to get $400,000 for the house, just for the sake of an example. I want to get $400,000 out of the house. Well, you going in there for a listing presentation, your question's pretty firm. You need to say, do you want to walk away with $400,000? Or do you want to list it at $400,000? Because that's two huge different numbers. So with that said, you need to go ahead and find out the number where they want to be. Because conversation with Mr. Seller is, if you want to walk away with $400,000, we can't list it for $400,000. We have to list it for this much more to cover your closing costs, to cover broker fees, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of times the seller, they're going to come back with you and they're going to say, well, my neighbor up the street, he got $400,000 for his, so I want to get $400,000 with mine. And the seller needs to understand, and this is what you do as a listing agent, you help the seller understand that's not what they walked away with. That's what it's sold for on the piece of paper. And you need to understand they probably walked away with $375,000 or $380,000. That's your job. So as a listing agent, when you get an offer from this buyer that says we're asking for concessions, and the seller says, I'm not paying any concessions, I already told you that. Your job is to sit with the seller and say, look, what we want to do is hit the number you want to net. If you want to net $400,000, you want to walk away from the closing table at $400,000, then all we need to do is counter this back and just add to the top what they're asking for. And we call this negotiating, by the way. We're negotiating. So instead of just saying, I want $400,000 on the house, you want to come back with an offer that includes what the seller wants to net plus what the buyer is asking for in concessions. So here's what's going to happen. That means that the seller is probably going to counter at a number that's higher than the listing price. And I've had this happen numerous of times in my career. So here's what happens on the buyer side. The buyer's like, I can't believe they're going to ask more for what it's listed for. And the buyer agent, a good, knowledgeable buyer agent, understands First off, that's part of negotiating. We're going to negotiate until we come up to the right price that everybody's happy. But the buyer agent needs to explain to their buyer, they're not going above asking price. They will sell it for asking price with no concessions. But if you're asking for $10,000, they don't owe you any money. They're agreeing to put it on their side of the deal. They will cover $10,000 on there as part of the deal. It'll be on the contract. They're not paying it. You're paying it indirectly on the contract. Now think about that. If it's a $400,000 house and the buyer needs $10,000 in concessions and the counteroffer from the seller comes back and says, we'll sell it to you with these terms that are on here for $410,000. They haven't upped the price, the buyer upped the price. And they upped the price so that they're part of the concessions and the fees that they have, closing costs, everything else that they need will be covered. And that's okay. And that's negotiating. A buyer agent and a seller agent both need to know their job very, very well. The listing agent on the seller side has to know what their client wants to net. The buyer's agent on the other side has to know what the buyer needs to bring the deal together. That's conversations. That's what you do in a buyer interview and a listing interview. You cover these things so that you know the people's numbers. And then when the deal comes about, you negotiate it. That's how it works. This is not a big deal. Processes hadn't changed that much. Contracts changed a little bit. But you know what? If you started in real estate today, this is what it would be like. So just pull up your pants and let's just go to work. This is not a big deal. Learn your job, learn how to negotiate, learn how to bring a deal together, and the rest of it's just real estate. But never forget, your job is to take care of your client. It has nothing to do with your commission. You have to be satisfied with what you get. If you get $1,000, $10,000, or $20,000, you have to be okay with that. If you're not, and you put it on the contract and somebody turns it down, you didn't lose anything. It's just not going to come out that way. But you cannot refuse to show a house because the seller isn't offering a concession. You can't do that. The buyer can decide not to go, but you can't do that. You have a good day. I hope this helps.